Welcome to Hex Command Gunpowder. So here are the basic concepts of Hex Command, and in particular Hex Command Gunpowder. The first thing to note, of course, is that we use a hexagon grid battlefield. One of the most important things to remember here is that this game is played with units facing the flats of the hexes, not the corners. So whenever units turn, they face a flat. They do not face a corner. The other thing to remember is that there's no measuring and needed whenever you use a hexagon grid. You don't need to have any kind of movement device or anything out there. You can easily see how the units can move. They can either move left, right, or forward. Now, the important thing to remember here, besides the fact that you can't just back up a unit, you can't step back. There will be cases when that does happen, but for the most part, you cannot order units to step backwards. They have to about face and move backwards and then about face again if that's their intention. So the direction is easily defined, but the other thing to note is that in some hexagon games, you're allowed to drift, move diagonally left or right, and still keep your forward facing. That's up to players for them to decide, but generally we don't allow that. We don't want that to happen, but it's totally up to the players if they think that's realistic. Units have to face the direction that they move. In almost every case, you must turn to face and then move that direction. Of course, if you have the facing changes available, then you can turn again. You can face change again. Generally, infantry only has the ability of changing facing once during the turn when they're moving, when they're activated. There will be cases, however, where some units can move twice or face twice. Cavalry, for instance, can face twice almost all the time, no matter how heavy or light they are. The other thing to note about using a hexagon grid is that in some cases the combat arc is defined from the back of the hex. For instance, the grid, the hexes left and right, you can see that whole angle going off the screen is eligible for the arc. But the truth of the matter is the combat arc is actually a little more narrow than that and slices through, technically, the next hexes as you see here. So if the unit that we see in blue was moved forward into that next hex, 2213, it's not that it would be cut in half and then only be half visible. That simply is an indicator to say that the unit can be fired at, but that if it was further away, it would need to be in that arc carried on above the screen here in order for it to be fired at. In other words, if it was at 20, I believe it's 2113, and the unit in red is at 2314, then that unit would be, the blue one would be out of arc if it was at 2113 or so. You can see by the angle of the black lines. Another thing to note is that you should keep your units together. Keep the brigades together as much as you can. Don't stack them up, get them so close that you can hardly touch them and move them, but just try and keep them as close to each other as you can, because they need to support each other, especially in situations where you may not anticipate something happening. The closer you are to a friend, the better you're going to feel about it, and you'll have supporting combat from the units around you. The other thing to note is don't do this like it says right here. Besides avoiding melee whenever you can avoid it, don't send individual regiments off to try and do anything. In rare cases can they accomplish something, especially combat related. They can take territory, but it totally depends on the situation. But generally speaking, a single regiment can't really do that much when faced with a massive enemy. A single regiment is not really that capable. It'll be outnumbered, or could be potentially outnumbered. So just be aware of that. Another thing to note is that cavalry frontally was ineffective, especially in the age of rifles, because generally, by the time the cavalry was close enough to threaten contact, they would have been shot so many times because the rate of fire and the distance at which they're being fired at. And that wasn't always the case, but generally it is the case that by the time cavalry got close enough, they would be too heavily engaged for them to really become a threat. And especially in the American Civil War, you didn't have thousands of troopers in a small space. They really were just not that numerous, so you didn't have that much of a threat to begin with. And then also skirmishers are a nuisance in this game, especially when used against artillery crews. Use the skirmishers. Not every regiment's going to have skirmishers, but there will be some. Send them out there, use them against artillery crews, use them to pin down or locate enemy or kind of provide a screening force, because they may not cause casualty hits, but they do cause terrain effects hits, and we'll talk about terrain effects. And this is a separate kind of a damage that's basically related to fatigue. So that's the kind of hits that skirmishers can cause on their targets. So the other thing that we do, we have several ways of activating. One of the most common is the die rolling for the percent of force that's going to be activated. You can activate only 25%, 50, or 75%. You'll rarely activate 100% of your force. It just didn't really happen. The other way of activation is by brigade, using the activation sequence, wherein you number all the brigades from 1 to however, say 4, and then that's the order in which you want them to activate in the turn. First brigade, second brigade, and third, and so on. The other player, of course, has the same thing, and so what happens is, in the phases of the turn, both players roll off on their commander values to see which player's number 1 goes first, and then followed by the second brigade, and so on and so forth, until all the brigades have been activated. So we'll get more into that later. The other thing for movement is that we can die roll each brigade's move distance. They either move half or they can move full. So you can move sometimes 1 hex, or you might be able to move up to 3 hexes. For cavalry, that might be starting at 3 and going up to 5. But essentially it means that it isn't always set in stone how far units are going to move. You can play it that way, but sometimes we like to play with this option because it makes things just a little bit unknown. You don't know how fast your guys are going to be able to move.
Another component used in the game is the brigade file card. We use these instead of placing markers on the game table. As you no doubt are familiar, there's a host of different colors and discs and things you can put on the game table to keep track of how things are going. But the brigade file card, in some cases also commander file cards and division file cards, are more realistic because players can't determine the status of a unit on the game table by looking at the markers. In other words, how many casualties it has, how close it is to becoming fatigued. These kinds of things that make the game very easy for new players, and also in cases where it might become confusing, or in other words, you need to have markers on the game table just to make things a little simpler. But the brigade file card, with recording these things, it's essentially obviously a roster card, makes things far more realistic. The way this works is that you simply record the identification number for the unit, the ID, its name, and how many terrain effects it has suffered, and then how many hits for casualties it has suffered before it routes. And you can see there are phases 1, 2, 3, and 4. Some units can go all the way to the 4th phase of routing before they're gone. Most units will never come close to that. The brigade file card can hold dimensional information about units. This is very exciting because it allows you to put more information into the game than you would normally have. It doesn't make it necessarily more complicated. It just adds a lot of flavor. For instance, units can have different characteristics. This unit self-rallies on rolling blue on the code and color die, and it suffers a TE hit only if rolling blue on the CNC die. So that means every time it comes up to an obstacle and overcomes the obstacle, like a wall or a fence or something, or going up a hill, it's only going to suffer a TE hit recorded to it if it rolls blue on the CNC die. The brigade file card is also the place, as you can see from the image, where you write down the brigade number. This is the 3rd Brigade, and the names of the commanders, its replacement commander if there is one, and then the starting divisional commander. In this case it says Ambrose Powell Hill. The card is also the place where we show the values for the command valuation system. The numbers are placed here. This is the value for combat bonus, the morale, which is for us a sphere of influence for the commander. In this
particular case, it shows a value of 2, meaning that wherever he is located, he will affect all the units in a sphere 2 hexes in size around him. And the tactical value and aggressiveness and initiative values, these are all die rolls based on a 1d10 system, which you all, in those cases, must roll higher than that value to make it pass, the situation and be successful at it, depending on what it is. It could be a tactical situation where you need to move something differently, where you need to react, which would be used for the aggressiveness, and initiative, which is used when we start the turn or to see who in particular would go before the other player. Or in this case, because we're using the activation sequence, when you're rolling to see which brigade gets activated before the other similar value brigade. For instance, over in the area of the brigade file card, oh, and by the way, this card is actually big enough for 12 units, about 2 brigades, including artillery and cavalry units. The blue lines underneath each of the white lines, rows, can be used also to enter other units. We were using these just for details about the unit that's written above it, but you can also use that for other units. In case the card isn't big enough, you can use that blue line. Anyway, the activation sequence, this is where you put the ID of each brigade in the division, shown here, along with its activation sequence number. So what this means is, as you can see, the ID of this 3rd brigade is, we'll just call it A. It's going to be going first in the activation sequence. The 2nd brigade is going to go second. The 4th brigade is going to go third, and the cavalry brigade is going to go 4th in the player's intention for activation. There will be cases where some brigades may have the same activation number, but that's somewhat rare. Generally, the game is meant to be played where each brigade has a different activation number, but historically, there may be situations where 2 brigades, and maybe even more, are activating at the same time. An example of this would be where the space permits such a thing to happen. An example would be Longstreet's advance on Cemetery Ridge, which was infamously known at the very end of it as Pickett's Charge, although there is some debate as to whether or not it should be called Pickett's Charge. But at any rate, in that particular case, the units might actually have all the same activation number because they were within sight of each other in a certain particular circumstance, able to all activate in unison, which is a very rare thing, especially in the North American terrain. Probably something more similar would be allowed of similar activation values in the wide open spaces of the Eastern Front and or ancient era Mediterranean temperate climates where the terrain enables visual sight for quite a distance. So here are the components, basically, of the game itself. These are the units that players will be manipulating on the game table. The first one is infantry. Here we see a typical infantry regiment. This is a 15 millimeter scale regiment, and you will notice that there's a flag being carried, which is the national flag. In this case, the Confederate national flag. And then there is a curious little red tube that's projecting from the base. This is the tube into which a flagpole is going to be inserted for this game that's going to have the unit identifying flag. The regimental state flag is going to be placed into that little tube. And that's going to identify the unit for you. So if you want to know what a unit is, you'll have to look at the flag. The next thing is cavalry. Here we see a Virginia cavalry unit carrying a flag, and there's just the hint of a tube just in the middle there. Another place to put an identifying flag, but in this case, the unit already has an identifying flag. I can't make out what it says right there, but it's a Virginia cavalry. This is a squadron. This is not a whole regiment or a battalion. In this game, because of the scale, a regiment of cavalry will be huge and occupy a great space on the game table. In this particular case, this is a squadron. The next thing, of course, is artillery. Here we can see a 4-gun battery. The size of this one is different than the 6-gun battery. Visually, commanders should be able to tell the difference. That's why a 6-gun battery takes up so much room or space on the actual battlefield. It's going to look a little different than this. This is a 4-gun battery. And below here we can see a limbered battery. So whether it's 6 or 4 doesn't matter. This is a limbered unit. And then we have skirmishers. Here we see the cavalry, in this case, has dismounted, and they are skirmishing ahead on a hill. And this is what the appearance would be. We don't always use the dismounted or the horse holder and horses symbol miniatures, but for the most part, when cavalry is dismounted, acting as skirmishers and dismounted cavalry, this is how they would look. But essentially, that would also be the appearance for an infantry regiment if it's in skirmish formation. Actually, it would be a whole regiment as skirmishers. Would be replaced by several skirmisher stands. Generally, when infantry puts out skirmishers, it'll just be an infantry regiment puts out skirmishers. It'll just be a single skirmish stand. And then we have command stands. Here we see 2 examples. One's top right-hand corner is a brigadier general or colonel, could be, of a brigade, and the bottom left-hand corner is a divisional or corps commander. And the piece of wood that's been attached to the back is where information would be placed on a label and about that commander. In this case, the corps commander or divisional commander has a tent and also some activity happening with other figures on his stand. So the next thing we'll discuss is movement and obstacles. Infantry moves 2 hexes, cavalry will move 4, and artillery will move 3 every turn that they are moving. Now, it has to be said that there are times when we wonder if this is too fast. But it depends on the scale, that is to say the number of hexes, the size of the hexes in the game table. And we have been considering that perhaps that is too fast. It could become that an infantry unit would move no faster than 1 hex, and cavalry would move 3, and artillery might move 2. Now, what you might be thinking is, well, that's odd, because how will a unit be able to go up a hill if it takes longer to get up a hill? Well, the truth of the matter is we don't do that in Hex Command. In the old days, we did. If you were especially counting inches, you would subtract a certain period or a certain quantity of inches based on what you were doing. We don't do that anymore. All we do is let units move the speed that we set, and for every obstacle they encounter, they get an increment of terrain effects. So if a unit moves, it can change facing 1 hex side anytime during the move, or if not moving, it can change facing any degree it wishes. Each time an obstacle is encountered, such as going up 1 level, moving over a fence, entering a forest, and so on, we will add a terrain effects hit to the unit. These terrain effects represent a level of fatigue. When units suffer enough TE hits, they become completely fatigued, are marked as such on the game table, usually with a tan chip, and they can't move forward anymore, and their combat value drops by 1. So these guys are really tired. You have to basically recover from that in order to become normal. Each additional TE hit they suffer becomes, at that point, when they're fatigued, a casualty hit. So they begin to suffer exponentially when they are tired, which is as you would expect. Entering a forest costs 1 TE hit per hex of forest that they enter. And to recover a TE hit, just simply don't move the unit. Let's talk about some other fundamentals in the game. This is how to fire. Basically, the game uses custom-made dice. Basically, they're kind of like average dice. We call them code and color dice that are used in the game. Each side of the dice has three red sides, and there are 3 blue sides. One red side, we have a symbol. In this case, we use a star. This is equivalent to rolling a 6 on a normal D6. The process when you're firing is to count the hex bands to the target, starting with the hex that's next to the unit, not the hex the unit is in, but the unit or the hex that's just in front of the unit in its arc. And for small arms, that is a single hex counting. For artillery, every 2 hexes is a band. So, in other words, it would be when you want to determine what you need to roll. For the first band, it would be automatic, as the drawing here shows. It's an automatic hit to the hex immediately in front of the unit in its firing arc. The next one would be color, which is blue, and the next range after that is red. And as we know, there's only 2 red faces because one has a star or a symbol, whatever you want to use, on it. So there's 3 color, which is blue, sides. There's 2 red sides, and there's 1 with the CNC, we call it, which is the symbol. Now, in some cases, that range is extended by 1 for heavy and rifled artillery. So you wouldn't have just automatic color, code and color. You'd also have code and color again because the item, the weapon has extended range. Either it's heavy or it's rifled. So again, there's 3 blue, which is equivalent to rolling 1, 2, or 3. There's 2 red faces, which is equivalent to rolling 4 and 5. And then there's the star itself, which is equivalent to rolling 6. Every time you have modifiers to that, you simply push it out or pull it in. In other words, you either add 1 to the increment or minus 1 to the increment. So if you needed to roll red or code and you had a penalty, that would push it, make it harder. So it now becomes CNC. If you needed color, which is blue, and you had a penalty of 1, so you would push it out further to the next band, so it would become code, which is red. So that's how it goes. If you get a bonus, you keep pulling it in toward that automatic hit. So the more bonuses you got, the closer you get to automatically hitting the target. So that segues nicely into the next subject, which is basically combat bonuses. Get those combat bonuses whenever you can, either by placing a commander where you think he can help, called attaching. But every time you do that, you run the risk of his getting shot and removed from the game. You don't have many commanders, so you got to be mindful of that. Wherever the commander is, if he's in proximity of any combat, there's a possibility that a separate die roll may be needed to see if he gets, in fact, killed. There's no wounding of a commander, either hit or not hit. So that whenever possible, get behind cover if troops on the field. Get behind cover like a wall or a fence, just like anybody would tell you. Always look for cover, but maintain your sense or ability of firepower as much as possible. And obviously that means high ground. So the higher you are, you don't get to fire further when you're higher. You just simply have better visual on the target, targets as the case may be. So the higher you are, the more of the enemy you can see, and you can choose what to fire at. If you're on a hill and your opponent isn't, you'll be harder to shoot at. So in other words, if you're higher up, that's called cover. If you're behind fence and you're being fired at, that's cover. A wall, same thing. Because in this game, cover is simply cover. There isn't various levels of it. However, that's also an interesting choice of words, because if you were in a forest hex and on top of a hill, that would be one level of cover because you're higher, and also because you're in a forest, so that's also cover. That would be 2. So you get 2 levels of cover in that particular case. What if you're on a wall, say Marie's Heights at Fredericksburg? You're behind a wall and you're higher than the opponent. Well, that's 2 levels right there. So you're in a very good defense position if you have cover like that and you're higher than the enemy. So in other words, even though we don't usually do them, if you were in a trench, you'd be in extremely good cover and be very hard to hit. So that's where you'd get super ability to defend yourself. And here we have the reminder about avoiding melee and keep your units together. Remember, Hollywood movies don't always show things the way they happen. 90% of the time, soldiers want to avoid hand-to-hand combat. It's not a good thing. It's extremely exhausting. Imagine, if you will, you're wrestling, either in school or something, or a club or whatever. You get very exhausted very quickly. So if you're in a hand-to-hand combat, in this case, you're fighting for your life, you're defending yourself and also trying to injure the enemy, or at least make him run. So it's very tiring. Once you get into a melee in this game, the chances of you succeeding are low, and the chances of coming out of it okay are very low. So you always want to avoid melees, and you always want to shoot as much as you can. So avoid the hexes around enemy units whenever possible. There are cases we can talk about where you can enter the zone of control of an enemy and it not become an automatic melee. And that is if you choose not to while the opponent has been disrupted or damaged in some way. When he has lost his zone of control, you can choose to melee him and be very close when he is unable to perform normally because of damage. So whenever possible, keep your regiments as close to each other as possible, because the more friends you have firing at the same target or series of targets, the better. So finally, thanks for watching this. I hope it was giving you enough information that you are now forewarned about how to manage your forces and the contest in the coming hour or two. And remember, this is a game like any other game you play to have fun by exploring the logistics of handling a force against another, setting the goals and exploring what it takes to command and control a situation as best you can. The winner of a Hex Command game is the one who manages resources and remains flexible with the twists and turns that fate presents you with. I would say good luck, but sometimes it takes more than just luck. Thanks.